So first, I'm Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, so I'm the Member of Parliament for Beaches East York, and I want to thank you all for attending our Drug Policy Town Hall. By popular demand and thanks to our Youth Council, and who you will see members at the back and a couple members at the front. Now, for those who have not attended one of our town halls before, if you have an interest in asking a question of our panel, and I'll get to introducing the panel in a second, but if you have an interest in asking a question, you'll have seen cards on your chair, and fill out those cards with your question, hold them up, and as you see, Diana is holding it up, and one of our Youth Council members will come around, pick it up, bring it to me, and I'll make sure I'll be moderating tonight, and I will make sure the question gets asked of our panel. So, I would like to thank everyone. We have a wonderful panel here. So first we've got Steve Watts, who's an inspector on the furthest left, who's an inspector with the drug policy, the drug squad here in Toronto, and really in charge of enforcement of our drug laws. We have Donna May, who is a drug legalization and reform advocate, who founded the organization Mums United and mandated to saving the lives of drug users, which is incredibly poignant when one realizes that her daughter actually passed away of an opioid overdose in 2012. We have Jenna Valeriani, who is finishing her PhD at U of T in cannabis policy and is also an advisor to Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And finally, we have J.F. Crepeau, who is a senior policy analyst with the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, CAMH, and actually drafted their cannabis policy, I think it was in 2014. Is that right? Oh, perfect. And by the way, the cannabis policy from CAMH, you'll see largely reflected in the Federal Task Force report in December of last year, and you'll see the Cannabis Act that has recently been tabled in the House largely follows the task force recommendations. So without further ado, we're going to have some introductory remarks from our panel guests, and thanks so much for joining us.
Okay. So first question is, do I need to stand, or can I address the audience from here?
Can everyone see?
Is this all right? Yeah? Okay. Worst case, just ask me to stand and I will. So thanks, Nate, for organizing this, and thanks to everybody for attending. So I actually was saying beforehand, there's a big Leafs game tonight, and like, are we going to have people here to talk about drug policy? But clearly, I mean, you guys are my kind of crowd, basically, coming out here on this particular night. I'm going to keep my introductory remarks short. I have 4 quick points that I want to make about drug policy kind of broadly, so not just cannabis, not just opioids, which I think are maybe the 2 main topics that we're going to talk about. So the first thing I want to say is that there are many approaches to drug policy, to drug laws that are possible. For cannabis, for instance, you've got jurisdictions that have the death penalty for possession and use, all the way across the spectrum to, say, Colorado, that has a rather commercial system of cannabis, sales and so on. So basically, whatever ideas we might have about the kind of naturalness or whatever of a certain way of doing things for drugs, I kind of want us to sort of push that away if possible. Point number 2 is that some drugs are riskier than others. Is that a function of how I'm holding the mic, or? Yeah. Okay. So some drugs are riskier than others, basically. So if there are studies that have looked at have done rankings of psychoactive drugs in terms of harm, and you have some that are quite at the kind of at the level of the most harmful that are actually legal, like alcohol and tobacco, and many drugs that are relatively harmless to most users, like say psilocybin, more often known as mushrooms, that are quite low on the harm scale. Point being, there's not necessarily any correlation between the level of control, of legal control of a drug, and how dangerous it actually is. And the third point that I want to make is that drugs can be harmful, but drug policy can also be harmful. That if you picture a system like in say Mad Men, for example, where in the 50s and 60s alcohol and tobacco were quite widely available. There was widespread advertising and promotion. There was a high level of consumption and hazardous consumption, as well as a higher level of harms as a result. And over time, I think we've realized that, and so we've brought in a certain amount of control. On the other end, though, if you think about the fentanyl crisis right now, basically in a market or in a situation where you have total criminalization that in itself actually can bring in a range of harms from just the actual harms of criminalization itself, being saddled with a criminal record and so on. Studies have shown too that people who face criminalization for their drug use are less likely to seek or to receive treatment, or either for the drug use or just other health services. So that can result in, that can facilitate the spread of, say, HIV or hepatitis C, for example. And there's also the fact that increased potency and as well as, what's the word I'm looking for? I think I've got it written right here. Contamination, there we go. So fentanyl, the fact that it's not a regulated product means that there's basically no way to actually know ahead of time, what you're actually ingesting. So the point being there, drug policy can have harms independent of the actual properties, of the drug itself. And finally, I would suggest that the goal of drug policy should be to reduce harm. Harms that can come from drug use itself or harms that can come from drug policy. So that I thought was a kind of a good sort of set of principles that I would, if there's any disagreement on the panel, I would invite, any sort of, disagreement is fine and good, but I thought that'd be a good kind of way to get us thinking about drug policy broadly.
Okay, hi guys, I'm Jenna. So I work with Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and we've been really active in trying to ensure that youth voices are being considered during the task force consultation. So we organized a youth roundtable in Toronto. We translated the outcomes of that day into a document, and we presented that to the task force. So I'm just going to use my time to kind of pick up on a few things that JF actually said. Simply that, to make a broader point, that when we think about harms of particular drugs, we also need to think about how the policies that govern those drugs can also lead to unintended consequences or harms. And sometimes, which is often the case with cannabis itself, those consequences that result from overly restrictive policy have been shown to be more harmful than the use of cannabis itself. So the second point that I'm going to make is more broadly about the importance of evidence-based education, using kind of the recently tabled Cannabis Act as my example. So I always like talking about this because I feel like protecting youth has really been this pillar of legalization. But what really stands out to me over the last couple weeks is this idea that the only way that we can achieve that goal of protecting young people is through, tighter restrictions. So heavier restrictions is going to, help us achieve this goal. So while cannabis should be strictly regulated, we also need to remember that the overregulation of particular drugs can also be problematic and actually result in more harm to our young people. For example, to use the Cannabis Act as a point of reference, the government has set a minimum age of 18 years old, and the provinces can adjust that to meet their, what they called individual realities. So what's likely to happen is we're going to see a variation of age of access across Canada. Some provinces might opt for 18 or 19, some might be higher, so 21 or even 25. I think it's really important that we're working with provinces right now to try to encourage an age of access that mirrors alcohol access. I have a whole spiel about how age restrictions aren't about when it's safe to initiate use, but age restrictions are about when young adults are able to make these choices. But also, I think the bigger point here is that age restrictions in and of themselves aren't enough to deter use or even delay the early onset of use. There's also an argument to be made here that really questions how well we're actually protecting young adults if we pushed them to access off an unregulated or illicit market. So our lens of what's harmful or what's risky needs to not only focus on potential individual health risks, but the actual policies that we're creating and the impact that that will have on young adults. Right now, for example, young people are disproportionate targets of drug-related arrests. So importantly, I think we need to consider, what things like higher age restrictions, might result in. Thinking of how we have a concurrent goal of, undercutting the illicit market, which is a major challenge in itself. It also makes sense to perhaps bring a lot of these young adults out of that illicit space. This gives us, a few advantages. It gives us a point of contact with these young adults who may be 19 or 20 or 21. We can ID them where the illicit market doesn't ask for ID. We can provide information and education, and perhaps, it could have the overall effect of cutting their ties with wider drug markets. But the most pressing issue in my perspective is the development of age-appropriate and evidence-based education for young people, which I'm not sure currently exists. So what steps are we taking as a province, and what steps are we taking as a city to ensure that this element is actually being prioritized? In my experience working with young people on cannabis legalization, they want access to non-judgmental but evidence-based education, and they often feel really overwhelmed by the availability of online resources that tell them a million different stories about, various drugs and their effects, and also, from peers themselves. So we need to really move away in our educational strategies from, this dichotomy that positions cannabis use as either abstinence only or problematic, right? There's never anything in between. If we talk about cannabis in a way that isn't resonating with the way our young people experience, these things, then we're losing that opportunity. So I saw a CBC report last week where they were interviewing educators and asking them how they're going to be approaching the legalization of cannabis and what kind of education they'll be using. And more often than not, they said that they're going to keep doing what they're doing. So I want to flag the idea that sticking to the status quo on the youth education file around cannabis is something that is really problematic and should be prioritized. And we are starting to see signs of general public education in Ontario and in Canada, particularly around driving under the influence. So if anyone's driven on the 401 recently, I'm sure you've seen the signs that are up there now as well. But what we've heard, overwhelmingly from other jurisdictions, especially Colorado, is that we need to start public education, especially for young people, as soon as possible. And we need to start thinking about education and prevention as a key tool to promoting the safety of young Canadians, not just restrictions in and of themselves.
I don't speak as fast as the first two speakers. I want to thank Nathaniel and his staff for bringing us all together tonight and for hosting this event and having this discussion. And I especially want to thank you who have come out to have this discussion with us and to debate whether the efficacy and effectiveness of our current drug legislation is actually serving us in a way that we would expect it to. As a parent who has lost her child to the war on drugs, I first want to explain that I'm looking for legislation in Canada's drug policy that is deeply rooted in honesty, compassion, health, and social care and recovery support. One would think that that would be our basic right as Canadian citizens, and I've been around for the last 5 years and can tell you that it isn't. I've come to understand that our current drug policies are based on fear-mongering, profiting, political and social status. It is currently having nothing to do with keeping our children who might choose to use or experiment with drugs safe when they're doing so. Some would say that it's the parents' responsibility to see that their child doesn't use drugs in the first place. But it is also just as critical that we acknowledge that in that moment that they're choosing to use a drug illicitly, a parent truly doesn't have control over whether that child will choose to use or not to use. It's essential that we recognize that there are a considerable number of different variables that might play into their making that decision. A friend of mine and a fellow mother who, like me, is widowed from her daughter, describes our loss so eloquently when she writes, "My child just wanted to get high. She didn't want to die." Sadly, and far too often today, our children are not given that opportunity to use the next time. They die the first time or the next time after that. And across our country today, the illicit opiate drugs that are available on our streets, and almost without exception are either laced with or replaced by fentanyl, carfentanil, W18, and other analogs. And very little is being successfully used to combat that. Using these drugs, or choosing to use any of these drugs, or drugs at all, is likened to a game of Russian roulette. You never know where the killer is until it's already there. The result of our draconian beliefs and the drug policy that has resulted from them is that we have been left completely up to those who are in the control of the black market to determine what goes into the drugs our loved ones are taking. That black market has realized a way and a means, regardless of the casualties that it causes, to make a higher profit through more addictive and higher strength opiates. It makes sense that if there weren't a profit in it for them, they wouldn't be interested in doing it. And it's asinine for us to believe that they have any concern for life over profit. We have it in our power to take back that control, and we're not doing it. Why? Because the notion of providing unadulterated drugs to substance users is socially unacceptable. And my response to that is it socially unacceptable to not save a life when we know how to and we can do it? Remember now, these are the lives that I'm speaking about are members of your and my family. They're your neighbors, and people that you interact with professionally. And believe it or not, an illicit substance user or one or more of their family members are probably sitting in this audience tonight. Is it not our responsibility, our duty, to have policy and procedure in place to see that our loved ones, your loved ones, makes it through this crisis alive? I can't stress this enough. We can no longer hide behind the methodology of just saying no to our children and believe that that alone will stop them from using drugs. That belief can and does have deadly consequences. And my own daughter's death was proof of that misnomer. I'm shattered, and my family is emotionally destroyed. Because since her death, we have come to realize that her substance use did not need to be her death sentence. Just saying that out loud breaks my heart. My daughter's death did not have to be. And I had it in my power, and you have it in your power, to see that that doesn't happen. If I had been assured of the quality and the quantity of opiate in the drugs my daughter was consuming, she may never have contracted flesh-eating disease that ate away at both of her legs and her buttocks and ended up in her internal organs. She may not have overdosed numerous times that caused cognitive impairment. I may have had the opportunity to gain her trust earlier and work with her towards a recovery that best suited her. She may be here speaking with you tonight instead of me. I do this work for her and in her name, so that others like her will not go through this unnecessary experience. So my question to you is, why are we as parents and community allowing this to take place? Why is it continuing? Why are we not using our voices? Why are we not demanding change? And why are we not taking control of this unnecessary crisis? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Donna. My name is Steve, and I want to thank Nathaniel for inviting me. Also, I want to thank all of you for attending. As Nathaniel said, I represent the Toronto Police drug enforcement unit. That's one of the aspects. We also do education, and it may or may not surprise you, but I'm going to agree with some of my panelists, probably more than you think, on some things, and I'll be disagreeing with them on others. What I can tell you is that drugs in our city and anywhere is about money. Drugs are a commodity. So I'll leave you with that thought. Drugs are a commodity, pure and simple. Think of it as any type of commodity, and that's what the economics are as when you apply that. In terms of harm reduction, Toronto Police is committed to the harm reduction model, but it is our position and my position that it also, notwithstanding the education and treatment side of it, there also has to be an enforcement side of it. We're looking at the people, the individuals that are preying on people, that are preying on different victims that are suffering from whatever specific addiction. So that's a component that can't be ignored when you look at overall harm reduction philosophies. So I look forward to all your questions and look forward to a good dialogue tonight. Thank you.
So the first question, and recently the Cannabis Act was introduced, and you'll hear the federal government repeat sort of the twin pillars in terms of purposes of keeping drugs out of the hands of youth and undermining the illicit black market. You'll also see, though, other purposes enshrined in the law, including reducing the burden on the criminal justice system. And I would ask the panel what your thoughts are. Is this good legislation? Is this sensible drug policy? Where is there room to improve, if any? And if there, your overall thoughts, and if there are ways to improve, what are they?
You want to start with this? I would say so far so good. Basically, that's my take. As Nathaniel mentioned earlier, so we released our report, the Cannabis Policy Framework, in 2014. It recommended legalization with strict regulation, and the Liberal Party kind of incorporated the main concepts there into their platform. And then that document also informed the work of the task force that the federal government appointed last year, which in turn has basically, I would say that the Cannabis Act introduced last week really does follow the recommendations of the task force. So to me, it's so far so good in that what I saw in the Act looks great, but there are, from a public health perspective, some pieces that are going to be really important that have been kind of left to the provinces to decide. So there's age, for example, and as Jenna mentioned, there's a bit of a tension there between, on one hand, wanting to make sure that ideally, you don't have, say, like, heavy use of cannabis, by a good number of, say, 18 and 19-year-olds. But on the other hand, you don't want to put that age too high, where then you're pushing youth into the black market, basically excluding them from all the benefits, that the legal market can bring. So that age piece is going to be really important. And there's also so for me, I won't speak for the other panelists here, but advertising and promotion is going to be a really important one. I would say there's not just a tension, but a contradiction between a public health approach and a kind of a commercial approach. And if you were to picture, say, the situation with alcohol in Ontario, we wouldn't want to see that for cannabis, where you have a lot of promoting, a lot of advertising, you have TV ads and that kind of thing. It's been shown that where jurisdictions are much stricter with that sort of thing, you have less in the way of alcohol-related harms. And similarly, we think that for cannabis, there should be a tighter, tight restrictions on advertising, branding, and that sort of thing. I'll mention, because a lot of people immediately will say, okay, but alcohol is actually a lot more harmful than say cannabis, and tobacco too. So the Liberals are talking about plain packaging, for example. And so I think that people in the cannabis industry, here I'm talking about the business people, might say, okay, well, you can't have a situation where marijuana is more tightly controlled than alcohol or tobacco. But from CAMH's perspective, we would much rather actually see alcohol and tobacco also be kind of held to higher standards as far as marketing controls are concerned. So we're hoping, basically, so far so good, and I hope that the provinces will take a cue, from what the feds have said so far.
So just to comment on a few things. Overall, I thought that the policy was quite progressive. I was, happy about some things. For example, there are some ticketing provisions that are being used. Particularly, it uses non-criminal sanctions to deal with young people 12 to 17 for possession under 5 grams. I think that's a good start. Some questions that I have, I guess, would be there's a 14-year penalty maximum attached to selling to minors. While I understand the need for restrictive and being very firm with that, it is grossly disproportionate to what we see when we think about, alcohol or tobacco sales to minors. Another question that maybe later we could ask our police, Steve, on the end here is really about the expansion of, being able to pull over individuals and, make them take a DUI test without probable cause. And kind of the one area that I disagree a little bit with JF on, even though I understand it represents kind of an ideal public health approach, are around branding and advertising. So I don't know how familiar we are in the audience with medical cannabis and the landscape in Canada, but we've had dispensaries, for example, illegal storefronts that have existed in Canada for close to 20 years. So within that, there's been years of, products that have developed branding. So I think that there's also an element to consider about how exactly we're going to undercut or eliminate an illicit market that is so well developed and has, developed loyalties with cannabis consumers across Canada. So I think that, with that point in particular, there's maybe some special consideration that needs to be thought about if our goal is to eliminate the black market, thinking about, what currently exists and what's out there and the way people have been accessing for a very long time.
JF and I were just at the Drug Futures Conference that was held in Ottawa, where we sat in strategy sessions on what the drug future would look like 10 years down the road. And what I recognized is 10 years down the road is going to be a lot of graves with crosses on them. What I brought up in one of the sessions that I partook in, that's probably the wrong word, that I was in, was that why are we not now looking at doing exactly what we're doing with cannabis for all drugs? And my reason for that is that we are already going to be breaking international treaty when we legalize and regulate marijuana in Canada. And other countries have done that, and they've pretended that they're not breaking the law, when in fact they are. The other states are just sitting back and sort of letting that take place to see where it goes. What we proposed to our Canadian government is that they are actually very vocal about breaking the law, breaking the treaties, and legalizing marijuana so that other states will stand up and recognize what we're doing and why we're doing it. And to really create discussion around the fact that we are in a situation today where we need to save the lives of people who are dying by illicit drugs. We believe, or I believe, that in legalizing and regulating and providing pharmaceutical-grade opiates to substance users who are already entrenched in the addiction will help to save numerous lives from being taken by these illicit drugs. Thank you.
Okay, just in response, my answer to that is we'll have to wait and see. I agree with my panelists that there's a huge factor here with the illicit market. So what I said in my opening statement, that it comes down to money, it's all about money. So how is it going to be taxed? And that's hugely relevant moving forward as to whether you can cut out a black market in terms of supply and demand. Because make no mistake about it, high-level drug dealers, cartel members, they are businessmen and businesswomen. They make serious economic decisions as to what product they produce, what product they move, and that will be very relevant moving forward. So that would just be my approach. And everyone knows we're waiting to see what the province says in terms of regulations, because that will be very relevant also in terms of any type of police involvement. Thank you.
But keep the mic because I'll be loud enough, I think. So one question we've got is agreement with Steve in terms of weed as a commodity, cannabis as a commodity, and the idea being that if we're not careful with legalization and regulation, if the price is higher than what you can access in the black market as a commodity, you're going to buy at the cheapest price. And so how as a government, if we want to ensure that we are undercutting the illicit market appropriately, price is obviously important, and from your perspective with years on the enforcement side, is it incumbent on us as a federal government to make sure we are undercutting the black market on price?
Well, I would say yes, if you want to provide a safe, and some people spoke to about it earlier, in terms of nature of the substance, whether it's cannabis, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's cocaine, if it's not pharmaceutical grade, people do not know what they're taking. It doesn't matter if you're an experienced opioid user or if you're a one-time, first-time opioid user, you have no ability to ascertain, no ability to analyze a non-pharmaceutical product. So that role, in answer to your question, there's a big health implication there. But yeah, it's very relevant in terms of what the tax rate will be, because, as I said, this is about money.
Let's go with a question for JF, given it's on mental health. So evidence-based research shows that, and this is small type, so excuse me. By the way, if you got your cards and you got questions on it, hold them up. Our young youth council will be coming around and picking them up. And if we do have this phone here is not just recording, we're also live on Facebook, so people online, if they've got questions, fire away as well. Okay, so evidence-based research shows that the prefrontal cortex is still developing into one's 20s, as well as D2 receptors, if that is a correct thing, I'm not sure. I've got no idea.
Nor am I.
In the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Anyway, the point being that there is some evidence from what I've seen. So the National Academy of Sciences had a recent report in January that was sort of a lit review as far as I understand it, and they did point to an association between cannabis use and mental health issues, especially among youth. And so if we haven't, the federal government has set it at 18, and is that not a live concern for CAMH?
That is an excellent question, yeah. And so these are things that we debated quite a bit, in the lead up. We didn't just kind of slam out this paper and there you go. It was a year and a half of debate, between some of our people who are social scientists, look at things, at the population level, and then clinicians who every day are seeing people, in some cases with serious mental illness, that can be made worse by heavy cannabis use. So this was a huge point of debate. Where we ultimately landed is that, so there's basically, there's probably no upside to, someone who's like 13, 14, using cannabis heavily. That's gonna, in a lot of cases, lead to, some irreversible damage, Now, so the person who wrote this question clearly knows a little bit more about the brain itself than I do, but what I do know is that the studies that have shown these links between, reduced education outcomes, reduced, even IQ and so on down the road, those studies were done on cohorts of kids between the age of 13 and 15 who were using heavily, so we're talking daily to near daily kind of thing. So clearly that's something that we want to discourage. I think that to leap from that to saying that 18-year-olds using cannabis are going to develop mental illness or whatever it might be, those studies that we're talking about don't bear that out. I think that I think one thing we all agree on this panel is that there's going to be a need for kind of fact-based education. I think it's important for youth to know that yes, your brain does continue to develop until you're about 25, and until that's done, then there are certain things that are kind of risky. That includes cannabis use. It includes alcohol use too. And as one of my colleagues likes to point out, it includes hockey as well, where they're actually, I'll just very briefly, if I may, point out that there was someone named David Nutt, who's a really interesting character out of England, he was the head drug person there, and he was forced to resign from his job as the drug czar or whatever, because he wrote a paper arguing that horseback riding was more dangerous than ecstasy. His point was that every time you get on a horse, basically you're taking more risk than if you were to do like kind of pure MDMA. So there's a bit of a link here where basically we need to rethink, what we mean by risk, and by association and so on. So not to underplay the concerns, but that to me there's no scientific or evidence-based argument for saying that because of these mental health concerns, there should be an age limit, of 21 or 25, especially considering that we seem to have as a society decided that 18, 19 is the age where we let people, vote. You're already driving by then, and so on. So, yeah.
So this one says for Nate, so I should probably answer it. What is the rationale to justify the 14-year penalty? And Jenna spoke to this for selling to minors. Will this not continue teenage use of the illicit market? I don't know that it will. I mean, whether it's a 14-year penalty or otherwise, the fact that it's prohibited to minors means there will to some extent be an underground market in the same way when I was a teenager and drank alcohol and we shoulder tapped or got it from siblings or got it from friends who are of age. No doubt that will happen to some extent in market of cannabis where it's prohibited to youth. Whether the 14-year, having said that though, we should not make, I agree with Jenna when it comes to, I was very pleased to see no criminal sanction for possession with respect to, for young people. It should be a ticket fundamentally. 5 grams is one thing. I actually think all criminal penalties for possession charges probably a waste of our time and a burden on the criminal justice system for no reason. The 14-year penalty seems high. Keep in mind that's for an indictable offense. It's always the option. I mean, if you're talking really not a serious offense at all, a 20-year-old selling to a 16-year-old and they happen to be friends, I don't think you're going to see the Crown pursue an indictable offense at 14 years. So we're not talking mandatory minimum penalties here. We are encouraging Crown and judges to use their discretion, which I think is important to remember. Maybe the 14-year sentence should come down. I would welcome your feedback on that. Perhaps a question for Jenna and Steve, and this goes to incarceration. Considering the high cost of incarceration and the burden on the criminal justice system, and note that reducing that burden is a principle in the Act, why would my federal government be unwilling to end the sentence for offenders currently in prison for actions that will no longer be a crime if this bill passes? And perhaps more to the point, perhaps speak to the continued enforcement in the interim, and do you think there's a better way? And as an example, I think Oregon did this, where they had licensed medical dispensaries pre-legalization. When they moved to legalization, knowing it would take a while, they actually enabled those medical dispensaries to sell on the rec side. And perhaps one interim way we could have pursued this is to have allowed LPs to sell through Canada Post to people that had proved they were of age, to avoid us continuing the prosecution. And so perhaps from a student perspective, but also perhaps from a police perspective, whether you view this as a productive use of time.
So I think one of the, kind of the reaction that we're seeing all over social media now is this question about ongoing arrests until 2018. So, I don't have too much to say to that. I agree. I think that for simple possession in particular, it doesn't really make sense to continue to enforce that. And then, what's going to happen come 2018 if you got some kind of possession charge in 2017? These are all really important questions. Oregon is a really good example. They set up a fast-track pardoning system for simple possession and simple trafficking for people who had no other criminal records, and they were, uncomplicated, I guess, offenses. So, these are all really, really good questions, and I'm sure we'll see, people really push the Liberal government on that piece.
Thanks. So just to be clear, we're talking about the current dispensaries that are operating?
Current dispensaries, yeah, sure. Speak to
Okay. Well, just... Okay. Well, I can speak to, I'll deal with all the unlawful dispensaries that are operating in the city. That ends up being and is currently a public safety issue. We have a high volume of armed robberies that are occurring at these, a high volume that are reported, and even more that are not reported. So you may or may not have heard previous media response or previous media releases on that with explosions related to butane hash oil extraction labs. And just the general, if there is an armed robbery at a retail location, wherever your neighborhood is, there is significant liability, not just to the people that are working there, but to the customers and to anyone walking by outside. So, and I'll speak to, no one in those locations, I can speak that, is getting charged with simple possession. That's just not happening. The people that are getting charged in those locations are trafficking, possession for the purpose of trafficking.
So I would say that is comforting to know in terms of not arresting people for simple possession. The only additional concern, and to keep in mind at least, would be strangely, we had a dispensary right next door to our constituency office that opened up after our constituency office opened, and there were young people working there as employees, and they certainly weren't making great profits. They weren't really the mastermind behind this organization in any way whatsoever. They were really a bystander in the whole thing. And so in addition to those folks who are perhaps purchasing for simple possession, just keeping in mind that the young people working the counter perhaps aren't deserving of a criminal penalty either. On that note, I also got a question about pardons. And given we've acknowledged as a government the flaws with the justice in the justice system surrounding marijuana, the current system is unjust, is worthy of change. Should we be pursuing amnesty and pardons, record suspensions we now call them, for those with current convictions? I hope we do. It wasn't part of the task force recommendation. It's not part of the current law. I do hope, though, once we have a legal framework in place, that is the next consideration, because whether or not you have a criminal record that comes out of it, even a charge will have an effect on your employment prospects and certainly has an effect on border crossings. And if we have changed the law, we ought to do it in a more fulsome way. So where are we going to go next? All right, so we're going to go, there are 3 questions, all kind of related. One is from Facebook Live about small growers worrying that they'll be shut out of the market if Shoppers Drug Mart or the LCBO take over. By the way, as a primer on, and maybe I should have done this at the outset, as a primer on the Cannabis Act, so the federal government is maintaining control and regulation with respect to the production of cannabis, but it will be up to provinces to control the distribution of cannabis. So many questions are still left open with respect to whether Ontario, we've had Kathleen Wynne suggest the LCBO as a model. Perhaps we could have a comment as to whether it's appropriate to be selling alcohol and cannabis in the same location. BC has a thriving dispensary market in contrast to the crackdown in Ontario, though there have been some crackdowns in BC as well. Perhaps BC would want to maintain that dispensary model, so the distribution side will be left to provinces. So a lot of the questions about that arise here, but perhaps we could answer about what should that look like from the provincial point of view. So how can legislation ensure small-scale growers are included? So that is from the federal side. How will the federal government ensure economic benefits of legalization are not further consolidated within LPs, perhaps? And how will legalizing marijuana impact pharma corporations? Will it make cannabis the next tobacco 2.0? And those are all generally related, and I think they all get to the point of what should this market look like going forward as a responsible marketplace?
I'll pick up on one piece of that, which is the distribution piece, because I think I probably have a point of view that I'm alone on this panel, and that's that, so CAMH has actually said that probably the best, as far as Ontario is concerned, that LCBO is well positioned to actually be the kind of the point of sale. So this is something that task force came out against. They were saying that you don't want to have like co-location of. Let me rewind for a second. So basically, our rationale there was that in this brave new world of legalized, regulated cannabis, you want to avoid a situation where decisions about expansion, like where to put stores, how many of them to have, et cetera, are based on just considerations of profit. And we thought that the best way of doing that would be to have a public, basically a government-controlled entity with a social responsibility mandate taking care of those decisions. And so we never mentioned, we never said LCBO, by name, but that's exactly what LCBO is. And although they do have a pretty, a very commercial approach to alcohol, if you look across jurisdictions, they actually do a pretty good job of, say things like age checks, or not selling to intoxicated patrons. There's a bunch of things basically where Ontario scores pretty well on alcohol-related harms. Now, the task force members, like as a group, they felt that it was a bad idea to sell alcohol and cannabis in the same location. And they kind of didn't really cite any evidence for that. I think it was kind of basically well, we all know that if you use cannabis and alcohol at the same time, it's not just like an additive, sort of high. It's basically multiple, whatever. Anybody in the room who's ever, used cannabis and alcohol at the same time knows what I mean. It's basically it's a combination that can be kind of trippy. So, so they were saying, ergo, you shouldn't sell them together. Now, our take on that is that co-use of alcohol and cannabis happens right now in the absence of co-sale, right? I mean, people use it together even though they're not buying it in the same place. So to suggest that one would lead to the other is silly. We also felt that we would want to avoid a situation where you have kind of cross promotion, picture LCBO, oh, try pairing this, I don't know, purple haze with that, Merlot or whatever, I mean, that would obviously be, from a public health perspective, not great. But you can picture, in the same way that you have the vintage area, or, you now have some grocery stores that sell alcohol. If you were to kind of keep it kind of circumscribed to a particular area, it could be with separate separate cash register. I'm getting a little bit too granular here, so I'll just come back to the fact that, okay, so one of our scientists he uses a really good analogy that
as soon as you get to a vintage area of marijuana, you've probably gotten too granular.
Too granular. Okay, so I'll leave you with this. So one of our scientists points out that if you go to a pharmacy, a pharmacist will dispense to you benzodiazepines with opioids, if you have a prescription for them, two products that if you take together, can very well kill you. And what's important about that is the information that comes with it. They'll actually say, so by the way, these two have interactions. You may want to not take them together and that sort of thing. So from our perspective, it's about how the transaction happens. The point of sale is a place where education can happen. And so given that concern about not wanting to turn sales over to just kind of unleashed private sector, for us in Ontario, LCBO, with those caveats actually makes sense. And we're alone in the health sector in feeling that way.
Just to address the other piece of that about kind of juxtaposing big cannabis and kind of craft cannabis or smaller producers. So a lot of my dissertation actually focused on interviewing licensed producers as well as dispensary owners. So, the first thing I would say is that, not all licensed producers are these massive corporations. There actually are a lot of cannabis producers who are licensed under the medical marijuana program that would qualify as small grows or craft cannabis in a sense. One that I interviewed, for example, was run by a mom, a son, and a daughter. So the three of them run the entire thing for most of the year until it comes to trimming and all kind of the other stuff. So, first of all, I don't think that we should perpetuate this idea that it's big cannabis versus small growers. But I think what really matters in ensuring an inclusive system is regulations that aren't too onerous, that people can participate in. So there are a lot of bureaucratic barriers. There's a lot of money that needs to go into, people who want to become licensed producers. So, maybe there's could be room there for a tiered licensing system depending on how big you want to be. So I think there's other ways to address that, but I don't think it's as black and white as, one side being the Walmart of cannabis and then the other side being kind of smaller home grows. I think that there's a lot of variation that exists in between there.
Well, that goes without saying. We enforce the law as it stands, but I still revert back. I do have a lot of similarities with the health position in terms of, and we go back to what is the nature of the substance that is being purchased, that is being ingested. So when you get into, personal cultivation, then you get into areas of how are you going to, we come back to the regulations. How are you going to regulate that? How are you going to monitor it? How are you going to control in essence, how are you going to control what's in the substance that you're ingesting? And that's really what it comes down to. So then that, once again, brings us back to money and regulations, the ability to facilitate that type of production. So, thank you.
I have a question. Do you think that the police really have a position in, yes it is, Steve, I'm sorry. You, Steve. Do you really think that the police have a position in monitoring people that are growing for personal use? Is it a policeable interaction?
Well, I want to ask a question. You'll have an opportunity to answer that, but I want to put a question to the whole panel on homegrown. So we will get to homegrown. By the way, so another primer on the Cannabis Act is every household can legally grow 4 plants up to 1 meter high. How that particular measurement gets enforced, I don't know if you're all running around with meter sticks, but that's the rule. But it is important, when we talk about I joke, but when we talk about undercutting the commercial market, allowing for home grow makes good sense. I've had a number of people write in and say if you can brew your own beer and you can make your own wine, growing a certain number of plants for personal consumption makes all the sense in the world. There have been some issues in Oregon with respect, and I imagine other states, but I'm more familiar with Oregon, with respect to nuisance issues between neighbors. And so there are going to need to be rules put in place where if there's a smell issue that a neighbor complains about, those that are growing are going to need to have some containment measures so that we don't have friction between neighbors for no reason. I want to answer 2 questions really briefly because someone wrote, can we get more than just hope, but a credible commitment from you as an MP to help those burdened with unjust criminal records? And on that note, someone else asked, because we know that drug policy is not just about money, but proven harm reduction, why is the government committing to another year of enforcement? And on both fronts, so I will say, absolutely, you have my commitment as an MP. I've written about this, I've mentioned this in a couple of my articles already, that I think we should pursue expedited record suspensions. I will certainly be advocating for that. I do think the law is unjust, so I think we ought to rectify that down the road, and I will be a voice for that. And I have also been an advocate. I lost the fight, but I have been an advocate for ending the arrests in the interim. I do think it's a waste of, I think there were other ways we could have pursued this. It is what it is now, and I'm actually very pleased to see what Steve said about not giving possession charges as much as possible. Okay, so on home grow. We have a few questions here, and I'm going to try and jam them all together. So this is a question just about Health Canada is going to allow LPs to produce cannabis. How can we really trust that the cannabis is pharmaceutical grade? Points to a couple of articles where the LPs were caught using chemical pesticides. And then if someone under the new act wants to produce their own cannabis, they also have to sign away their privacy as it's written in that particular part. So concerns about privacy and home growing. One question for Steve, won't police be kept as busy as ever under the new law? If there's a maximum of 4 plants, how are we enforcing this? I would also wonder how we're enforcing the meter rule. And so to what extent do you foresee law enforcement spending resources to really say you've got 5 plants or 6 plants in your backyard and we're cracking down? And if the new law allows for personal plants, does that not alter the notion of cannabis as a commodity if people can grow their own? And it's not just legal for dealers versus illegal, and supply can be personal, so it undercuts the black market. So your thoughts on home growing, here are some starting points to it, and perhaps we'll start at the other end for Steve.
Okay, I would agree that law enforcement's ability to enforce personal cultivation will be very difficult, and I can tell you why. The issue with it is it's in terms of overproduction and diversion. So that's what it comes down to, diversion, which we've all been talking about early on, to the black market. So how are you going to regulate it? And it all links into money. So I've had the privilege and the experience of going to probably in excess of 500 marijuana grow operations in my career. And so you get into all different types of in-home type of dangers, whether they be electrical safety, whether they be pesticide exposure, et cetera. So counter to, we're talking about youth health moving forward. So how do you regulate that? If you're going to have numerous in-home grows, how do you regulate and how do you justify, no access to youth under whatever age you determine it to be? So, and Nate was saying, the nuisance issue. I can tell you the nuisance issue is alive and well in Toronto, not just Oregon, okay? Numerous complaints with home grows, whether they be under the old system, whether they have a license or not. Numerous complaints with smell and issues. So that's quality of life in neighborhoods. So that's essentially my position on the personal cultivation take. Thanks.
So very supportive.
I'm incredibly naive when it comes to marijuana. I'm sorry, I have very little to say. My experience with my daughter was all about opiates.
I kind of agree. I see that there obviously will be difficulty with enforcement. I always think back to the first medical cannabis program where there was home growing allowed. Now there is as well as a result of a court case. But, a big problem with that was that, police couldn't just enter somebody's home and kind of, ensure that they were growing within their limits. But at the same time, Colorado, for example, has a 6-plant limit. I don't see, I just don't see any harm more generally in allowing people to grow, given that you're being respectful to your neighbors. I don't have much else to add.
Nor do I. I'll just pass it on.
Sure. Keep in mind, on the enforcement side, it may be hard to enforce a given rule, but sometimes the rule itself, there's virtue in having a rule because it gives some direction to a community or a country. So if we say to citizens, you have a 4-plant limit, generally speaking, I think people will abide by that limit. And it may be very difficult to enforce if you've got 5 or if you've got 6, and some people will break that rule. But I can tell you, if someone is growing 30, it will be easier to enforce. And so it's always going to be somewhat arbitrary whether it's 4 or 6. I was personally very pleased to see home growing in there, but I do recognize that particularly on the nuisance, I think we should learn from other states. And we did have one question in here, why can't we just copy or adopt one of the European countries, whether the Netherlands or Portugal, Uruguay's policies, which is actually the first country, they beat us to it to legalize cannabis, or any of the US states that legalize Colorado, Oregon. And I think part of the point has to be learning from, it's always better to learn from others' mistakes rather than learn from your own. And so I think we learned from Colorado that there was, to JF's point about commercialization, if we want to take a more public health approach, we can learn from Colorado's approach. If we want to learn about the nuisance issues, and I recognize they're alive and well in Toronto, but there has been a more regulatory, there have been rules put in place in Oregon to try to deal with this. We can learn from that. So that would be my answer to that question. So on usage rates, and we talk about undercutting organized crime, but we also talk about tackling youth consumption. And youth consumption of cannabis in Canada is higher maybe than any other country. Is that, I see head nodding, so I think I might be right. So higher than any other country. And when you look at the stats, even not just youth, but you see, I think it's 43% of Canadians self-report to have consumed cannabis at least once in their life. So usage rates are high. How do we tackle usage rates? And if I'm just to get these a little bit better on record, I've heard mixed messages about the use of weed among teens. Some say it declined in Colorado after legalization. What's the government's information, but better yet, what's the accurate information from you guys? How do you ensure that illicit use among the young will decrease? And we've got, so how does, and this gets to a similar point, just about how does the government plan on dealing with the illegal sale of weed, regardless of we have a regulated marketplace, but take the example given on the card is contraband tobacco. So while usage rates may decline or stabilize or uptick, we are going to undercut the black market in many ways, but there's still likely to be a black market to some extent, and how do we deal with that?
Maybe I'll start with the part about what we can expect to see in terms of usage rates. So obviously it would be a concern if you had, like a big and lasting increase in in cannabis use, especially among youth. Now, jurisdictions that have legalized or quasi-legalized, so the Netherlands, for example, is quasi-legalization, you could say, all of them saw an initial spike in use, which then declined. You can call it the curiosity effect. I know some scientists call it like a straw fire effect, where there's like, it burns bright and then kind of just like fades away. And that's among youth and adults. So I think we're kind of bracing ourselves for that as well. 2 points about that. One, use is not the same as harm, right? So if you see an increase in use, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll see an increase in harm. I mean, those are two separate things. So what we'll be looking at carefully at CAMH is, not so much has prevalence gone up, but rather have we seen an increase in people seeking treatment for cannabis dependence? Have we seen an increase in collisions due to impaired driving? Like, those are the sort of harm indicators that we'll be looking for. And I think also it should be said that if we see that some of the particulars of these policies are really problematic, we need to be prepared to tweak them, But another piece is that we're also quite hopeful that even if there is, so right now, as Nathaniel said, there is a lot of cannabis use, and right now people, for the most part, don't really know what they're actually using in terms of potency, in terms of quality, and the various kind of additives that there might be. So we're actually also hoping that just the fact of having a supply of cannabis with quality control, where people actually know, oh, okay, so maybe if I'm concerned about THC levels, I can choose a lower THC cannabis or higher CBD, et cetera. That information, I think, is going to be crucial, so that could have some protective effects, even if there is a bit of a bump. We'll also be at CAMH very curious to see if there's more cannabis use. Is that partly displacing other kinds of use? You could see public health benefits potentially if you had people who were using cannabis more but actually using alcohol less, for instance. So there's a lot of questions. It'll be really interesting to see.
Just to pick up on the youth piece of that, there's a really great report released by the Drug Policy Alliance called So Far So Good, and it analyzes kind of the data that's been coming in since legalization across Colorado and Washington and a few other states. So I think, you have to take that with a grain of salt. I think, as JF said, the straw fire, right? So it just kind of happened, so we don't really have kind of the long-term data that would give us kind of more concrete answers, but in that report, preliminary evidence from both Washington and Colorado has demonstrated that youth use has remained relatively stable, and this is including both past month and lifetime rates. So that's a really promising kind of preliminary finding. I have seen one article that pointed to an increase in Washington, but that was done with a sample of about 30 schools, whereas the Drug Policy Alliance report uses statewide measures. So you kind of take these things with a grain of salt.
Somebody brought up the Portugal study, and I just wanted to address that. And it is true that in Portugal, when they did decriminalize drug use did go up. And it was thought to be unsuccessful at first. But over the period of time, in a short period of time, it actually leveled off and decreased, and they found that more people were seeking recovery than ever before. And I think we're going to see exactly the same thing with cannabis use. And for me, this started in 1974 with my husband's, at the time, substance use of smoking pot to relax. And he was a very strong activist in having it legalized and thought that it was going to happen within the next year or so. And here we are in 2017, he's long passed, and we're still debating exactly the same thing. I hope it doesn't take as long for other substances.
Okay, I just go back to the health component. I'll let my panelists here leave it to them with that, but that's really the concern. Goes back to, and I keep harping on this, but it truly is the nature of the substance. I can give you a little fact. I was involved in a case where there was supposedly marijuana being sold to high school kids in a certain area of the city, when in fact it was marijuana, but it was laced with heroin. And then what happened was the kids came back, and as you know, or you may not know, now you're dealing with a whole different substance and a whole different world. So that just brings me back to the whole regulation, the whole nature of the substance, and moving forward in just that aspect of it. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that we can all agree that everything that we're talking about tonight does need to be regulated and controlled in some way, that we just can't let it go helter-skelter.
I've always thought when you talk about prohibition, in many ways it's the absence of regulation. So when, as a teenager, when you're buying cannabis, you might buy alcohol from your older sibling and you know the percentage and you know where it came from and you know that it's coming from a regulated source, and you buy cannabis and you have no idea what the level of THC is, you have no idea how high you're going to get, you have no idea if it's laced with anything. So there is the absence of regulation is worrisome in the black market. Okay, so I'm going to impose a lightning round on myself because we have a number of questions that I don't think we're ever going to get through at the panel, and there are a few questions that I definitely want to get to. So we're going to try and finish up in about 20 minutes or so. So we got to be out of here by 8. Strict end time. Okay, so thoughts on marijuana versus methadone treatment. So I think JF kind of touched on this in terms of a couple of different points. One, in terms of you're going to see in a legal regulated environment, you're going to see likely different dosages of THC in cannabis, and people can select their own. And you may well see, from a public health perspective, you may well see people turning to cannabis as a substitute for other drugs. There's no perfect solution to this, but it's very well possible. So 2 questions. Is there a plan for the funds that government obtains through a legal and taxed marketplace, and recognizing that the tax can't be so high that it drives the underground economy, but recognizing there will be some tax revenue, what are we going to do with it? And the task force was very clear, and the government has been very clear in question period through Bill Blair, that this is not a money-making exercise, this is a public health exercise, and that where funds are generated through taxation, they'll be put back into public health initiatives, be it education or treatment. So that's an easy one. How can cities benefit from the new law? Really, it'll come down to the distribution that provinces opt into. It may well be that a dispensary model, the city will be able to generate money from property tax revenue, and but they may well be you may imagine a scenario where there are licensing fees for home growing, so that the city can actually provide some regulatory structure, and that it will be funded through that. I don't see great money making through there, but there may be some revenue generation. Why does the federal government not implement the same policy across Canada? We are a federation, and so for the same reason you see alcohol distribution regulated differently in every province, you're going to see cannabis regulated differently in every province. In fact, the provinces could have an argument that even production should be regulated differently in different provinces. Our argument, I think, would be under the criminal law power, because cannabis has been a criminal law for so long. So, as a follow-up to a previous question, what can citizens, community members, students, etc. do to ensure that their MPs and government officials implement amnesty policies? Contact your MP. We're not scary people. Sit down with us. Talk to us about what you care about, and you'd be surprised that if a number of people contact their MP and make a reasoned case, you will see more of us advocating for these things in Ottawa. Are the large tobacco companies going to roll out packages of joints? I have no idea. But keep in mind, we are going to see strict packaging rules. We are not going to embrace commercial advertising. It's public health. There are major restrictions on commercial advertising, and likely major restrictions on what will be on packaging. What's the public health Ontario going to stop, when is Public Health Ontario going to stop chest compressions only for drug overdose in a breathing emergency? I have less idea than about the joints, but I would encourage you to speak to my provincial colleague Arthur Potts. Despite the act, you will never get rid of a black market. That's, I think, questionable. I mean, I think when you look at the experience with alcohol prohibition, we do not have an underground economy in alcohol in the same way that we once did. So I think there's good reason to believe that we'll be more successful. How will no smoking for cannabis be enforced in multi-rental units? Again, we're getting very granular, and but it's a real question. I mean, I think landlords will be able to put rules in place that restrict smoking in the premises. Again, to Steve's point, the nuisance concern is already a real issue in Toronto, and we don't want to exacerbate the problem. Who will be able to sell LPs First Nations? I mean, again, the distribution side is a provincial issue. From the standpoint of production, LPs are in the production business right now. More growers are being licensed. The medical growers are all licensed in the rec market now, but more growers will be licensed going forward. Okay, so I wanted to get to these questions because we haven't dealt with them. And one question in particular, I think, I would consider myself a drug policy advocate in many ways. I'm very happy to see our government pursuing the legalization of cannabis. I think it's sensible drug policy. It's long overdue, going back decades to the Ledane Commission. But there's one question that I do worry about, and that's from a policy and legal standpoint, how will we control cannabis-impaired drivers? Do we have the tools in place to do so? And how will it be different, if at all, from drinking and driving?
So what I will say is that that's a huge. I'm really glad that we're discussing this, because social scientists have a way. So there's something called burden of disease, where they'll basically, for any given health issue, they can quantify, what it costs to society, basically. And for cannabis, the bulk of the burden of disease of cannabis is actually due to impaired driving. People say, "Oh, nobody's ever died of cannabis use," and that's, there's some truth to that. But actually, impaired driving is a huge issue. And I'd actually be most curious to hear from our friend in law enforcement, because I personally, have an idea about, I know the scale of the problem and that it's one of the big things we need to address. But in terms of the specifics of that, I mean, there was a new piece of legislation. Anyway, I'm going to pass along the mic, but just to kind of pump up the importance of this question.
Right to me. Eh? Well, I'll just backtrack a bit. Everyone here knows where we're at essentially with alcohol and impaired driving, right? It's become it's 20, 30 years ago, believe it or not, alcohol impaired driving was kind of acceptable. It really was, and that's the reality of it. And those of you who are in the room who are my age or of an age of me, you would, to be honest, you would have to say it was. That has changed drastically, 180%. So now our younger generation, and it was through education, it was through a whole variety of things, but our younger generation, and with the cannabis, look at it completely different now. So, but yet we're dealing with a mood, a substance that alters your ability, and it alters your sensory motor ability to drive a vehicle for your fine motor skills. So it is a very, very large concern with the police and with moving forward. And I think we addressed that in the initial CACP with the task force. And I think, they focused on that. It's too early to tell right now. The testing is not, I'd say it's not exact, it's not foolproof. And I expect it to be challenged, to be quite honest. I would expect it to be challenged in the courts in terms of the constitutionality of it, as compared to the previous kind of standards that were set for alcohol. So it's a complex, but it is one of the primary concerns of law enforcement moving forward. But that, it's a very complex, layered issue. It goes back to my colleagues here that are in the health aspect. How much THC is in it? How much did you ingest? Is it ingested with something else? Once again, it gets into a whole series of issues. So we're still in the very early stages of that.
So rather than Rather than passing the microphone back and then back to Steve, but by the way, on the driving note, it's important to keep in mind, regardless of legalization, we know that cannabis usage rates are, I mentioned high among youth, I mentioned 43% of Canadians have used it in their lifetime, but actually 12% self-report using it at least once a year. And so it's important to note when you're self-reporting, it's likely even higher than that. And it's also important to note that regardless of the rules we have in place, people are driving high right now. And so, and we can say we need tools in place, and absolutely we do. The great thing about legalization and regulation is that we are going to be able to better enforce what is already happening. Now, okay, question for Steve, and I'm not going to be as pointed as, but both questions are about the disproportionate impact upon low income, racialized, and really about, it's an enforcement question. So knowing that the Toronto Police, there has been racial bias perhaps in the past, the card mentions carding, whether more enforcement will mean disproportionate policing for racialized communities. In not just racialized communities, I would also note different outcomes across the country. So I had a constituent who was arrested in Espanola and charged for 15 grams. I sincerely doubt that ever would have happened in the city of Toronto. You mentioned not arresting people for possession. It did happen in Espanola, and he was charged and the Crown pursued it to trial. So maybe you could speak to just ensuring that the police avoid the disproportionate impacts on young people, on racialized communities, and on low-income communities.
Sure, no problem. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that there's not people that are getting arrested for possession of marijuana. I'm sure that's happening. What I can tell you is that my unit is not going out and arresting people for possession of marijuana. In terms of unlawful marijuana dispensaries, this is a trafficking, large-scale possession for the purpose, proceeds of crime. This is, these are larger scale investigations. And I would also take that question, I'd go a step further in terms of the racialization. And I believe it's a conversation that has to be had moving forward. When the regulations do come in place, where are they going to authorize, or where are they going to allow these type of dispensaries to operate? You know, is it going to be in lower socioeconomic communities or not? So you can look to alcohol, look to corner stores. We had a conversation earlier on. All of you know the deadliest drug, kills the most people worldwide, alcohol, right? 6 million people a year, alcohol. Second is tobacco, both legal. And an argument can be made that those two products were marketed in different areas in different ways. So that's how I'd address that.
Can I just say it's an important argument for amnesty too? I think the fact that certain communities have been disproportionately targeted by law enforcement makes it that much more important to think about the, I mean, basically that's who would benefit, I think, from amnesty is the people who have been disproportionately targeted. So it's a kind of reparation almost, you know?
So this is a question for Donna, and both are, I'll read them both in different ways. So the first one says, I'm sorry for the loss of your daughter. If it were up to you, what would be the first step toward addressing the opioid crisis, and what would be the end goal? And related, given that the illicit drug trade is profit-driven, see Steve's comments before, why aren't we decriminalizing the personal use of all drugs and treating addiction as a health issue and not as a crime has occurred in several other countries?
Thank you for your concern. I actually look at my daughter's death as a gift, and I know that that sounds very strange coming from a mother who's lost her daughter. But without her having had this experience and living the last 6 months of her life under my care, I would never have gotten the opportunity to understand her substance use, why she did it, and what caused it, and what she got out of it. And it was that education that I needed to be able to move forward and be able to be here tonight speaking to you. So bless her, because she went through a lot in order to educate me. So the first question.
What's the one thing you would do as the next step?
The next, thank you. It would be education, exactly what I'm doing now. Standing up and using my voice, being able to tell people what the truth really is behind substance use. For my daughter, it was social anxiety and child trauma. For other people, it's completely recreational. It's just a choice, maybe a bad choice made in the wrong moment. But the fact that they are losing their lives because of these choices doesn't need to be. So it would be my advice would be to stand up and educate, use your voice. I've asked Minister Philpott personally for national educational programs on media and social media. I don't see any of that taking place. Those are things that I believe that a community needs to have in order to be completely and truly informed about what is happening out there on our streets to our children. There was another part of that question.
It was talked about decriminalization of all drugs.
What I would say to the decriminalization of all drugs is look at the benefit in it. When we criminalize people for using drugs, my daughter, her husband, for instance, it left my 3 granddaughters without a mother and without a father in the social care system. So it's costing every one of you to take care of my grandchildren, whether it's me that cares for them or outside of my home. The death of my daughter has created generational costs. I have a granddaughter who is now 21 with 4 children. She's trying to substitute losing her mother by being a mother herself. The youngest child has disorders caused by substance use during pregnancy. Think of that cost. These are all conditions that we have a certain amount of control over. And in criminalizing or penalizing or putting people in jail because of them is not doing anything to stop the cause. We need to treat this as a health concern, not a criminal one.
And briefly to editorialize, there are other jurisdictions, and the audience member noted them in the card. Portugal being one, there are others, but it's interesting. I wrote an article in January in Vice calling for, I suggested that moving towards regulation of all drugs according to their respective harms would be the appropriate thing to do, and as a first step, decriminalization of all drugs for personal possession, that it makes no sense, as Donna just said, we should treat it as a health issue, not as a crime. And when you look at the international evidence, and you look at the people who are advocating for this, so you've got Louise Arbour, a former Supreme Court Justice in Canada, former UN Commissioner for Refugees. You have Kofi Annan, who received a letter when he was Secretary General of the UN from over 500 signatories on the left and the right. Your Milton Friedmans of the world and your Noam Chomskys of the world are advocating for this very thing. And Kofi Annan, after receiving that letter, fast forward from 1998 to today, he's now advocating for the very same thing, that we ought to remove the criminal penalty for drugs, that it displaces resources that should go to health are being spent on law enforcement. It stigmatizes those who are users and the very people in need of our help in the first place. I would say as a first step, though, and let's talk incremental, we're not going to see the decriminalization of all drugs tomorrow. However, we are seeing safe injection clinics open up in more municipalities, and that will save lives. I know that Jane Philpott is very much a believer in a health approach and not a criminal justice approach, and has very much pushed that Bill C-37 to make safe injection clinics more accessible. One thing we could do as the next step is, right now you can consume drugs at a safe consumption site or a safe injection clinic, but you're forced to acquire the drugs elsewhere. And so one easy step we can take would be to ensure that there's a clean supply of drugs free from fentanyl, ensuring that people are more likely to use the drugs on site because they can acquire them on site. And I think that would be an incremental and a logical next step. Okay, so we haven't talked about edibles. The federal legislation puts it down the road a little bit. Uruguay did the same thing. They punted the question of edibles in their first legalization attempt, and we followed suit. One concern that I would have with edibles is that there's, generally speaking, for those who have consumed cannabis, you have a general sense of how high you're going to get if you smoke it or consume it through a vaporizer, but if you were to eat it, you have no idea, and it can be incredibly debilitating and impairing. And so what should the market for edibles look like? What will the policy be with regard to edibles? The answer is we don't know yet, but what should it be? And perhaps we'll have both JF and Jenna answer.
Sure. So the concerns are exactly what you mentioned. There's also another public health concern, which is the possibility that people who might not otherwise have picked up cannabis are like, oh, well, that's people who might be turned off by smoking or vaporizing might be fine with just picking up a cookie, and there's the risk that could lead to problematic use. The flip side of that is that if you're going to use cannabis, you probably will see less, the respiratory issues that come with smoking, and we don't really know much about vaporizing, but the, basically all other things being equal, edibles are probably better from a public health perspective. There's also, I'm not sure, in the task force report, like in legislation, there's talk of not wanting edibles that will appeal to kids. The task force report said there shouldn't be any edibles that look like a regular food product. Yeah, and I don't really know what that means. What does that leave, really? It's a tricky piece, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it gets fixed. I realize I'm not answering the question. I'm kind of fleshing out the complexities, but this is something we're going to have to figure out, I think.
Yeah, I think just, having responsible regulations, we can limit, the dose that goes into a particular product. I think JF makes a really good point when he talks about how it's an alternative to smoking. So maybe that's actually something that we should embrace with regulation. There is, concerns around accidental ingestion, for example. So that's been a really big thing in Colorado, and I think something that we need to watch out for. And exactly the idea of what counts as appealing to young people is really, I think, purposely vague. So, seeing where that kind of ends up is interesting. But if you look to the illicit market right now, a lot of the edible products actually mimic common food products like Kit Kat bars and Nutella. So I think that is a piece of kind of what they're trying to address as well. So another thing is also that when people make edibles at home, it's really difficult to consistently dose them. So, you may have one really strong cookie and then one really weak cookie. So maybe another way to look at it is that, giving people access to regulated and properly dosed edibles so that they know what they're ingesting and how strong they're going to be is probably a really good tool that we should be giving users.
Okay, so for those without access to a smartphone or are too polite to break it out, it is 2-1 for the Capitals. We're gonna close now and we're gonna ask the panelists to give their closing remarks in a minute or so. Thank you, everyone, for attending the town hall. If you do have follow-up questions, I haven't gotten to all of them. If you want a question answered that hasn't been answered tonight, shoot me an email. Make sure I'm taking home a note. Come talk to me afterwards. I will stick around. I do want to make sure all your questions get answered. And without further ado, let's start with Steve at the one end. And the only thing I would note is when it comes to JF, this is a real question. So marijuana is proven to cause mental health issues, according to this question. And so is there a concern about it burdening the healthcare system more in the long run? And I think you'd be particularly well placed to answer that.
Hey, thanks. I just want to thank Nate for the opportunity to sit up here today and address you. And just to tell you to move forward, the Toronto Police position is public safety. And so you have a lot of radiating effects. We've talked a lot about theory and a lot about drug policy. We deal with on the ground, on the street issues, whether they be nuisance from neighbors, whether they be armed robberies at dispensaries, or whether they be the traffickers that are supplying illicit drugs to our youth. So that's our focus, and moving forward, we're committed to that. Thank you.
And again, thank you, and thank you to everyone who came out to listen to us this evening. When my daughter began using drugs, I was dealing with Addiction. Today, you are dealing with something totally different. You're dealing with an opiate crisis, and one that is not easily controlled. I had options with her addiction, and that was treatment and treating her humanely and taking her under my wing and helping her through it. Right now, you're facing your children going out there and using drugs, illicit drugs, and dying from them being poisoned. I would encourage you to use your voice and use it with people like Nate within your jurisdiction. I would also encourage you to write letters. I know that Minister Philpott does read them. She read mine, and that's why I got to speak with her. These are the voices that need to be heard, right from the ground on up. We can't leave it in the hands of our policymakers and trust them to make judgment calls that will actually save the lives of our children. Thanks.
So I guess I would also just thank Nate for organizing this, but for always being a really strong advocate for sensible reform when it comes to drug policy. So I guess I would just leave you guys with, I really think that the Cannabis Act represents a really great first step, that we have, there's some things that we would all change, but I think that, it's the collection of, voices of Canadians across Canada, and you can really see that kind of come through in some pieces. And I would also say that, hopefully that this is just kind of a first step and just a beginning to rethinking the way that we regulate drugs in Canada more generally. The last thing that I wanted to say was just that that we need to continue to advocate for the people who have been disproportionately harmed by cannabis prohibition. So not just when we're talking about criminal records, but thinking about how we're going to ensure a diversity of players or diversity of inclusion in the market. What steps are we going to take to ensure that the potential or future cannabis market isn't going to just be but white men. So what steps are we going to take to ensure diversity in that market, which includes the people who have been traditionally harmed by prohibition?
So this is a good note for me to end on as representing CAMH. It's important to recognize this complicated issue with mental illness. So on balance, what the studies show is not a causative effect, but an association between cannabis use and mental illness, where basically what we're seeing is that people who have a mental illness, it can be made worse by THC in particular. I use that term because other cannabinoids we're not so sure about the impact they can have. But, and so basically, and it can also potentially trigger symptoms in people who have kind of a personal, or a family history rather of mental illness. It's a tricky thing, and there's something called the lower risk cannabis use guidelines, which I would encourage you all to look up. It basically starts by saying things like, if the only way you can avoid completely the risks of cannabis use is to not use it, but if you're going to use it, here's some things to think about. And one of the pieces there is that if you do have a personal or family history of mental illness, you may want to consider not using cannabis. And if you're going to use it, you may want to consider using cannabis that is lower in THC or higher in CBD, cannabidiol, which we haven't really talked about here. So it's important, and I hope I haven't sounded too flippant about this association. It's a really important thing, and some people will be harmed by cannabis use, and ultimately with this set of, with the legislation and regulations that we've been putting forward, we are just trying to create a situation where on balance, you're actually reducing the level of risk that people are exposing themselves to. And I'm optimistic that with the kind of regulations that the federal government is proposing and the provincial government hopefully will implement, that we're doing that. So thanks again to Nathaniel for creating this platform where we can talk about these issues. There are no easy answers. It's really complicated, but we need to keep having these conversations so we can kind of figure out what's working, what isn't, et cetera.
Great. So I just want to say three things in closing. One is thank you for coming out, and don't let this be the end of the conversation. So I have asked to speak to the issue in the House. We're going to have second reading. It'll go to committee. It'll come back at third reading. There will be opportunity to get up in the House and debate this. And if you want me to be your voice on this, if you think there should be changes, if you think the 14 years should come down, if you think the 4 plants should come up or disappear entirely, I may not agree with all of your comments, but I do want to hear them so that I can incorporate them. I can answer you with evidence, or I can incorporate them into my own remarks in the House. The second thing I would say is we know that I don't want Steve to be out there enforcing cannabis laws. I want him to be out there enforcing other laws where Canadians are breaking the law and hurting one another or stealing from one another. I very much don't want Steve's time and other law enforcement time to be spent on measures that we know over time have been ineffective. When we have the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which has included the folks I mentioned, Kofi Annan, former presidents from a number of countries, and Louise Arbour, and they're saying that for all of the resources we've spent on curtailing supply and consumption, they haven't worked. But we know it does work. And an interesting Canadian, Steve mentioned tobacco as one of the most harmful substances after alcohol. Interesting to note, 50 years ago, how many Canadians use tobacco? How many Canadians smoke cigarettes? 50% of Canadians smoke cigarettes. How many smoke now? Under 15%. And so we know what worked. We know it wasn't cracking down with respect to law enforcement. We know it was public education. We know it was restrictions on commercial advertising, restrictions on public consumption of public smoking. And we know what works from a public health perspective, and we should be applying the same principles. And the last thing I would say on education is, and Jenna mentioned it, is with respect to really speaking about responsible use. And I think that has to be the message. It's going to be legal, and now we have to talk about responsible use. And when we talk about alcohol campaigns, the alcohol campaigns should be about, let's stop binge drinking and stop drinking and driving. And similarly, we don't want people smoking every day. If it's a medicinal issue, that's fine. People shouldn't be going into work. People certainly shouldn't be going to school high. These are the messages that have to get to people. We don't want anyone driving impaired. These are the messages that have to get to people, that there is a way to responsibly consume cannabis, and we have to educate people about what that responsible consumption is. So with that, thank you so much for coming out today. And if you do have follow-up comments, I'll be standing at the door. So thanks very much.